Christopher Lasch is a brilliant young social historian at Northwestern University, and a book that has received indeed wild acclaim by several of his colleagues, a number of his colleagues, is called The New Radicalism in America in the years 1889 to 1963, the first half of the 20th century. The subtitle, to me, perhaps could be our text for this conversation, The Intellectual as a Social Type. Now, Mr. Lasch recently has published a long piece in The Nation. It's a very provocative piece indeed, dealing with CIA-subsidized intellectuals in America, specifically the Congress of Cultural Freedom, and even more specifically the magazine Encounter and its rather strange history. And it seems to me, Professor Lasch, Chris May, the two works are connected. Your book that Richard Hofstadter calls a remarkable work. If I could just quote Professor Hofstadter, a bold, superbly written book with many fresh, shrewd perceptions about figures we thought we knew well. Lasch writes as one deeply engaged with contemporary ideas and issues and promises to become one of our major commentators on America. And now the subtitle, Intellectual as a Social Type.
Right. Well, one of the things I was trying to do in the book and in the article, too, is to explain certain recurrent patterns of thought among American intellectuals, political thought in particular.
Well, I was thinking on that very point, the political thought of American intellectuals. In the preface to your book, The New Radicalism in America, you speak of the intellectual as a distinctive social type, somewhere in the preface, speaking as a class apart. He, in a sense, is the outsider.
Right. At the beginning of the 20th century, in this country, somewhat earlier in Western European countries, I think for the first time intellectuals became aware of themselves as a special group having even special interests, if only a vested interest in intellect. And this experience of sort of collective coming to consciousness, self-consciousness, I think has a lot to do with the way they respond to political, cultural events of the 20th century. As for there being outsiders, this is something that I don't think is true any longer.
Well, that's the point. That's why I was thinking of your article in The Nation just recently, and here you're speaking now of some intellectuals called the Cold War liberals, ever since Cold War began, who are very much inside, aren't they?
Right. Both as academics and, though the article in question doesn't deal so much with academics, who are, of course, very much involved in the whole network of the national purpose, so-called, the national defense.
Yeah, the thing that fascinates me, again, I come back to both. That this will be sort of a double-pronged conversation. It'll concern both your article in The Nation and your book, New Radicalism in America, and you point out certainly very colorful and key figures during the first half of the 20th century. Is the intellectual then, up to the Cold War, had been someone who challenged the power structure, challenged the status quo, challenged the basic values.
Yeah, that's true for the most part, though even earlier, even, for instance, in the 30s, there's a discussion that was analyzed in the last chapter of my book, which appeared in several issues of the New Republic in 1931. And one of the points that's made in that discussion by Benjamin Ginsberg, who contributed to this debate about what intellectuals should be doing in the face of national crisis, the first of many such discussions, was that even dissident intellectuals who apparently occupied very radical positions, had a great longing to identify themselves with the sort of sweep of American history, with a kind of myth of the American people, the American purpose, and so on. Even then, I think, the position of being outside was becoming so unbearably painful that efforts were being made to identify with something in American life.
You also mentioned something, I think, here, both in the preface to your book and in the article, the elitism, the quality wanted to be powerful, too. that, in fact, their whole misinterpretation of what radical thought was comes out. You, in your article, you imply they they were radicals for the wrong reason to begin with.
Yeah, I think that American intellectuals have been, I think more than other intellectuals in other Western countries, though to some degree this is probably a general condition in the West, are very reluctant to accept the premise that the best way for intellectuals to be powerful, if you like, or to influence events is by being intellectuals and not playing at becoming expert advisors or inside dopesters, or let alone playing at being revolutionaries, which is another sort of stance that intellectuals have fallen
Isn't this
into.
the point C. Wright Mills made?
Yeah, it is. And in one of his very last essays, a very good essay, he makes exactly this point. Yet Mills himself is very sort of ironic figure, because he himself embodies a lot of the wish at the same time, in his career.
As a participant, you mean,
Yeah.
in revolutionary thought
Yeah.
or involvements. Yeah. So there's in a way, you're not denying apparently a paradox that's continuously flowing through here.
Yeah, even now, I think.
Where does this now, as we enter now into the substance of the book itself, the first figure is Jane Addams, but before that, there are two things involved here, aren't they? The fact that the intellectual himself feels somewhat apart, and often we're told he should, at least seems to me, the romantic version, maybe it's mine, that he always must identify himself with the outcast,
Yes.
and not the man on the top.
Yeah.
And thus we have
That's
a great many identifying themselves with the man at the top.
Yeah, one of the things that I think was fruitful in the whole sort of progressive generation, of which Jane Addams is a representative figure, is the sort of acute identification with outsiders.
Let's take Jane Addams. Even her friend for many years, Jessie Binford, seems to have misinterpreted something that Christopher Lasch points out with some dazzling insights. The feeling was, and even Edmund Wilson too did in his essay on Hull House, that Jane Addams, a little girl, found this feeling of the world outside herself thanks to her father, and an event she saw in London, a father who told her of the death of Mazzini and of Lincoln. And you say it was something wholly different.
Yeah, I think that, of course, she herself is partly responsible for this. In her own autobiography, she has a tendency to adopt this kind of, I think, much too simple explanation of the way people's beliefs and attitudes and sort of lifestyles get shaped, which is not simply through external events or influences, paternal or otherwise.
See,
But in her case, I think she was suffering from a sense of being a superfluous member of society. This was related in part to her increasing awareness of poverty, which doubtless, deepened this sense of having nothing to do, no useful work. But it was also related to a number of other things.
Well, if we could just wander a bit, we'll return to Jane Addams in a moment. At this point, at this turn of the century, you speak in other chapters on the woman as an alien.
Yeah.
This theme, the middle-class woman who had education, suddenly found for the first time there was this kind of woman who was aware that there was something else to her life. She need not toil. Mm-hmm. And there was a meaningless unless she became involved outside herself.
Yes, yeah. And again, Jane Addams is certainly a representative of that.
But I'm fascinated by an event I've read about a number of times concerning her life. When she, as a young girl with friends, and she was ill, and went to Spain and saw a bullfight. And the usual story is she was horrified by the gore. But you're saying something else.
And for this, you have very good warrant in her own writings, because in the chapter of her autobiography in which she describes this, she makes it very clear that she wasn't revolted, but on the contrary, she was fascinated by this sort of historical spectacle which brought to her mind reveries about gladiators and Rome and the sort of antiquity of European history, and I think the enormous price that an advanced culture exact, the sort of centuries of suffering and misery, blood. And I think it was this that was unbearable, that the combination of her total absorption in this spectacle and then coupled with her instant revulsion afterwards and self-disgust. And the way I interpreted the broader meaning of this, which is only a guess because she herself doesn't say this, is that she was faced with a kind of choice that Henry James, in a very different way, made, whether to accept this or not, to accept Europe and all its horrible history.
Here you point out that this is dazzling to me in Christopher Lasch's book. The re-examination, the self-examination of Jane Addams, who became the questioner of establishment, the questioner of the idea of blood and culture, and Henry James, who accepted it indeed as a way of life. Two different approaches. One who was very status quo indeed,
yes,
and Jane Addams, who was anti. Yes. One, but blood and culture. The fact is, she was caught. She, a middle-class woman in America, was caught by the spectacle. As Kenneth Tynan himself admits,
yes,
he's caught by it, though he knows it's horrendous.
Yes. Now, I think one of the things I was getting at, and probably didn't say clearly enough in that passage, is that, as you point out, James was a conservative, and the implications of this acceptance of European tradition and of a long history are probably generally conservative. And in a way, the price that Jane Addams paid when she became a reformer or a radical, whatever you want to call her, was a rejection of this sense of history that she had certainly had very acutely, for a moment at least, at the bullfight, in favor of optimistic assumptions and melioristic assumptions that, again, run all through 20th century American reform. It's too bad that there couldn't be a little more sense of the the past in American reform. The one thing that may be happening now is that it may finally be possible for Americans to admit that they have a history, like Europe, and indeed that they're part of European history and are deeply implicated in centuries of European colonialism, for instance, the slave trade, and our whole history is bound up with this. And it's been possible for a long time sort of to ignore this and favor the belief that we're uniquely favored and somehow the laws of European history don't apply to us. We don't have class conflicts or struggles or any of this. It's, the day of reckoning is sort of arrived now.
This is interesting, the pastlessness, as though there were a sense of guilt. There's nothing has ever happened. No, it's not so. To use this phrase here that you write, Christopher, about Jane Addams, about nothing could have made more clear to her what was wrong with a life devoted to beauty alone, the kind of life represented by her stepmother, this noblesse oblige lady. For here was beauty intertwined with and depending upon the most outrageous cruelty, beauty bought with blood. And thus we come to perhaps affluence bought with blood, a sense of feeling powerful and righteous bought with blood. Mm-hmm. And you're saying we must confess to this, we must face up to this history.
Yeah. Without at the same time lapsing into Jamesian sort of conservatism.
No, that's right. James says, okay.
Yeah.
And whereas Jane Addams, you're saying, had she dug into the past more, would not, because now you speak of her work. You don't denigrate her at all, but you point out certain flaws that almost led to the thing that Hutchins condemns, adjustment courses, adjustment to life. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
As John Dewey.
I think that one of the things that the progressive educators failed to foresee, and this would include Jane Addams and Dewey himself, is that among other things, the enormous resistance that that their ideas would encounter, and nor did they anticipate what would happen when their ideas became bureaucratized in the form of an elaborate structure of professional education. And this is why I don't think they were prepared for the debasement of their ideas that took place afterwards in the 20s and 30s, which they deplored, but without, sort of changing the base of their social thought. They still had the feeling that if you simply said what was true, people would accept it. There isn't much, in other words, in American 20th century radicalism of the kind I was analyzing in this book, there doesn't seem to be much room for a recognition of conflict as something that sort of characterizes history and you have to be prepared for.
And also you point out that without her meaning to, there was sort of an anti-intellectual approach to Jane Addams' technique.
Yes, that's a word that I suppose one shouldn't
I know, I'm afraid
throw
to use
around.
it, but how can...
But I did say that in my book. The anti-intellectualism coming from, and I think reflecting what I was talking about before, this sense that ideas, at the same time, many of these people were overconfident about the possibilities of persuasion. On the other hand, they tended to debase ideas in view of a sort of celebration of life and these great life
Isn't that
forces.
her phrase? The West, something I paraphrase.
Learning from life itself.
From life itself.
And many such phrases, which I don't think I would ever accuse Jane Addams of being an anti-intellectual.
No,
but
I mean,
there are implications here,
it
which
could
later,
lead to it.
Yes,
that's what, in a sense, to the adjustment courses.
That's right.
It's the last thing she and John Dewey wanted.
Yeah.
But it led to that, and you come back to the theme of the special role. Again, the word intellectual is a terrible word to use because of the, how can I put it, particularly in America, there's a snobbishness involved to it, to the use of the word. At the same time, in Europe, this doesn't have this implication.
Well, I suppose the willingness to at least use the word intellectual is another slight indication of a willingness to admit that we have a history too, and that America isn't simply one big democratic amorphous mass, but
isn't the fact too that the empire builders, the horny-handed men who were the robber barons and the doers and the big boys, were really proud of their illiteracy or semi-literacy.
Some of them were. Certainly Commodore Vanderbilt was gloried in that.
And therefore the intellectual would have a connotation that might be not really American.
Yeah, that's right. Also, it has, in American culture, it has for a long time, I think, had connotations of an insufficient masculinity in a country where the whole idea of culture has been associated with women, in the 19th century anyway. It was a long time before this became really, culture became respectable for a man.
We know that, say, here in Chicago, for example, in the early days, it was the wife of the packing men, or the wife of Potter Palmer, who became it was the patroness of the arts rather than patron.
That's right. And this pattern persists to a remarkable degree, even now.
And also, but Addams, now we come to another theme that's today, yesterday and today, past and present. She was aware, of course, of what we call today the cliche, the generation gap.
Yes, that's one reason that makes her, one thing that makes her such a very relevant person now. She wrote very well about that. Though, even then, perhaps it simply wasn't as great a gap then, I suppose, as it is now. I don't think she would be so confident now about the possibilities of bridging it, because now this gap seems to have become almost absolute in some.
So it leads to a figure, if we'll come back to the chapter on women, figure Randolph Bourne, who probably would have been very, very much a la mode today with the young, wouldn't he? Tell us a bit about Randolph.
There is a kind of minor Bourne revival, based largely on the fact that he was a prophet of the sort of cult of youth, which makes him attractive to
Let's talk a little about Randolph Bourne and perhaps a cult of youth. He's a certain figure, a certain hunchback who died at the age of 32, young enough indeed to become a cult figure of the youth as James Dean, and in a wholly different way.
Yes.
So Randolph Bourne, who was he?
He was he grew up in a little town in New Jersey, Bloomfield, New Jersey, which was in the process of becoming an industrial town, in what he describes as a very stifling middle-class gentility, dominated by women, his father having left home at an early age. and on top of which he had a hunchback and various deformities, which made him automatically an outcast. After a long period of he worked in a piano factory and so on, he finally got a scholarship to Columbia at a rather late age, and suddenly blossomed forth into a very polished essayist and a spokesman for something or other. It wasn't very clear in those days, just before the First World War, exactly what it was. Some form of radical cultural attack on I suppose, the genteel tradition, first of all, and then of youth as representing the sort of hope of mankind. But in my opinion, Bourne doesn't really come into his own until the war, when he, almost alone, of people writing in liberal magazines.
It's World War I we're talking
World War
about.
I, yeah. Opposed the war without conditions, and at that point emerges as a very powerful critic of the intellectuals who had reconciled themselves to the war without much difficulty, it must be said.
And some of his liberals
pieces,
then too.
Yeah,
they were hot war liberals.
Hot war, yeah. And some of his pieces, and particularly an essay called "The Twilight of the Intellectuals." Is that right?
Is it? I'm asking you.
It sounds.
It sounds good.
It sounds. I think that's right.
It's very funny. I think if it were up to the Conference of Cultural Freedom, subsidized by the CIA, they would call it "Twilight of the Gods."
Yes. But this essay and other essays written during the last months of 1917, first months of 1918, are really among the most effective attacks I've seen on precisely what we were talking about earlier, the amazing ease with which intellectuals have adapted themselves to the prevailing requirements of power in the United States. And also their amazing confidence in certain public leaders. There's been a whole succession of leaders with which American intellectuals have identified themselves. Theodore Roosevelt, and then Wilson, and Roosevelt in the 30s, Kennedy, and have invested much too much trust and confidence in these people.
How would you explain this? Because basically your book deals with the beginning. It's the new radicalism, the beginning of the 20th century, the first half. This is a kind of a new development, wasn't it?
Yeah.
This faith in political leaders.
Yes, it was. I don't find anything like it in the 19th century, even in the case of leaders who, I must say, warranted more confidence, like Lincoln, who had a pretty bad, on the whole, reputation among intellectuals, even though, of course, there was a tendency to glorify him after it was all over. But really, even the case of Roosevelt appealed to a smallish cult, but Wilson is the person, I think, who first, the adulation of Wilson is the first notice that this sort of syndrome...
Well, was it because Wilson himself was an academician?
Yeah, sure, that helps a great deal. And this, one of the guises of the 20th century political leader is as an intellectual, or one of the sort of manifestations of power.
I'm thinking of something. I thought you mentioned Lincoln didn't have much intellectual support. I think of him as even later on, perhaps even over-glorified. Yet I think I don't know why, the figure of Estes Kefauver comes to my mind, whom the intellectuals laughed at, and their worship went all to Adlai Stevenson. Yeah. And I suppose if I had a choice, I would certainly say the stronger of the two was Kefauver. But this is interesting that one had the trappings of the intellectual.
Yes.
See, Lincoln never did.
Yes.
Nor did Kefauver.
Yeah. Yeah, these are no question about their being appealing. Yeah. There's much more to it than that, though. I think this reflects the fact that it's very uncomfortable if you have the feeling that you really are a member of a social group that occupies a marginal position in society, not in an economic sense, because intellectuals have, on the whole, been pretty well paid in America. But in a society, if you sense yourself living in a society that has no use for ideas, And there's always been a strong tendency to exaggerate the degree to which American culture is a wasteland. You cast about for some force larger than yourself, or larger than intellect, some historical force moving in the right direction with which to identify yourself.
As you're talking, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sometimes it's a charismatic leader like Woodrow Wilson or Kennedy, and sometimes it's a vision of kind of democratic populism, as in the 30s.
Isn't also a vision of having a little clout? I mean,
Yes.
if I see, and as I marked here, middle-class intellectuals conscious of their own powerlessness, the awareness. And here, gee, a guy like Schlesinger, wow, I'm in power.
Yes.
A guy like Walter Whitman Rostow, wow, I'm not intellectual, but man, I got muscle.
This is, I must say that Rostow in particular is one of the most frightening people around, and I have the feeling that his academic background has something to do with the kind of extreme taste for power that he's manifested since he acquired some.
So this leads to, even though the seeds began somewhere at the turn of the century, the seeds were there, now it reached a rather interesting flowering, hasn't it?
It has, and if you simply remind yourself of the number of terribly powerful people in the Kennedy administration who have continued in the Johnson administration who had academic backgrounds. Rusk certainly, I think, qualifies as coming from the sort of academic foundation world, and these two tended to become indistinguishable. People go from one to the other with ease. Bundy, Rostow, the two Bundys, for that matter.
So where does this is we return now to the other part of Christopher Lasch, the article in The Nation that deals with this very theme. There was a bugaboo, the Cold War. There was the rise of communism in various parts of the world, and in the name of anti-communism, almost anything could be justified.
Yes. There's also, I think, a specific set of circumstances which help to explain why, not so much why intellectuals in the 40s and 50s accommodated themselves once more to the requirements of power. In this case, the need to prosecute the Cold War and to see life in Cold War terms. But to explain the real venom behind this movement, a great many virulent anti-communists in the 40s and 50s were ex-communists, had been communists in the 30s. I think you have to see their careers and this whole experience as in a way that stresses the continuity between the 30s and the 40s and 50s. What strikes me is that in both cases, if you ask yourself the question, why did a revulsionism with Stalinism following the Nazi-Soviet pact or the Moscow trials take the form of virulent anti-communism, the form of a rejection of any radicalism, really? I think part of the answer is that in both cases, both in the case of the Stalinist episode in the 30s and in the case of the wild reaction that followed, what attracted intellectuals again was power. The fact that they were attracted in the 30s to Stalinism instead of to some other form of Marxism, among other things, was to be attributed to the fact that Stalinism was in power in the Soviet Union.
This come now, here we come to perhaps one of the keys in Christopher Lasch's book, this remarkable work, The New Radicalism in America. That was in your article, too, that these guys were radicals for the wrong reason to begin with.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at, yeah. And again, in writing about the 30s, much too much, I think, has been made of, in trying to explain why intellectuals were on the left in the 30s, too much is made of their humanitarian motives, the fact that they were appalled by suffering and so forth, which may serve as a general explanation of why they were on the left and why they rejected certain aspects of American democracy, rightly so. But what has to be explained is this peculiar fascination with special form of radicalism in the 30s, namely Stalinism. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of that, but I don't think either that it can be waved away as a peripheral phenomenon.
We come back to this, funny, as the precinct captain would say, where's the clout? Who's your clout? Looking for clout here again.
Yeah.
When he comes right back to the pavement term.
Yeah.
We can return to Randolph Bourne, and you say he came into his own as an opponent of World War I, no holds barred. At the same time, why it occurs he might be indeed the darling of the young today, because he was questioning not just specific material value, but the whole culture. I think you used the phrase here. Questions, I've made a note here, was not just to the war, but to all our values, as many of the young are questioning, not just our adventures now, but everything we represent.
Yeah, and the brilliance of his war essays is that he was able to see the war as a manifestation of these values, as a product of the social system in which the war was taking place, in a way that very few other people were able to do in that period.
You think had he been alive to this conjecture, of course, had he been
Yeah.
alive today and a mid-20th century man, thinking as he does, as he would have thought in 1967, he might have been...
I don't know what would have happened to Bourne, and one of the reasons I don't know is I don't know what happens to a man like that in the 20th century. He was attached to no movement, and it's pretty clear to me that he never would have been, because in the end, he probably would have been revolted by most of the political movements going. This is, in fact, one difference between Bourne, who was a very solitary and isolated figure, and young radicals today who sense themselves as part of a movement. Indeed, this is the whole meaning of the present to them. And I think without this sense of belonging to a movement, they would be lost.
Well, this comes back to that paradox again, doesn't it? Forgetting youth for the moment, the whole idea of the intellectual, the role he plays as the critic, detached, yet how detached?
Yeah, I know.
The detachment could lead to Hermann-Kahnism, couldn't it?
Yes, these are genuine problems, and I'm not trying to suggest that they're simple, and that nor am I suggesting that the best thing for an intellectual to do is simply to retire into absolute detachment. But on the other hand, it's been often fatal for intellectuals to identify themselves closely with movements, some of which never materialized in any case.
So here's this, again, paradox and irony at work there. We haven't touched on other aspects of your book, particularly involving women and the sexual revolution. And Mabel Dodge Luhan is quite a figure, a friend of D.H. Lawrence.
Yes.
Why did you include her in your book? Because in reading the chapter, I can see...
a lot of people wondered about that. She doesn't really qualify as a radical in any sense. She was apolitical, except for a few brief sorties and very abortive ones into politics.
And yet there's a very logical reason you have her here. Though.
Well, she does represent another current of emancipation, or another kind of hope for emancipation, which, if you want to put it this way, has probably diverted an enormous amount of energy from kind of rational politics in the 20th century. More so at other times than others, as in the 20s or the 50s, those sort of apolitical decades, when a lot of people were wholly caught up in what she represents, this search for an intense personal life, of which sexual emancipation has always been conceived to be part. Also, I was fascinated by the interplay between Mrs. Luhan and D.H. Lawrence, whom she tried to capture for her sort of menagerie without success, finally. And Lawrence is, of course, an even more interesting figure, because he's at once the kind of chief prophet of the 20th century cult of emancipation through sex, and its most effective critic in some of his writings, and especially when he's confronted with a woman like Mrs. Luhan, where he can see how what began perhaps as a wish to be liberated leads to this kind of devouring, predatory relationship with people. He can penetrate very beautifully to the.
I don't know why the image came to my mind. Hedda Gabler. I don't know why. Do you think there's a relationship there?
Yeah.
Because Hedda and herself, Luhan, of course, was Mabel Dodge Luhan was much more free and courageous and bold, whereas Hedda was playing the establishment game at the same time. As we turn the tape here, remind the audience talking to Christopher Lasch, the brilliant young social historian, part of Northwestern University faculty, and his book. It's been out several months, but a year about.
2 years.
2 years. That's a sign of my getting old. The New Radicalism in America, and that is the radicalism at the turn of the century, first half of the century. The subtitle, and that's the key, the intellectual as a social type. And Alfred A. Knopf for the publishers, and it's a remarkable and very incisive work. But what about this theme? We could return to Mabel Dodge Luhan.
I wanted to, yes, there was. You asked me why I included her. There was another reason, and I guess I was just getting to it. When I was talking about her tendency to devour people and the way in which this movement for sexual liberation in so many women, men too probably, becomes associated with not a free kind of personal relationship, but on the contrary, a very predatory one. And the subtitle of that chapter is Sex as Power. And the really striking thing about this woman is that sex becomes a way of managing people and of prevailing. And her whole relationship with Lawrence, and in fact all her husbands and lovers, sort of divide themselves among those whom she could manipulate and control, and those who weren't susceptible of this, and like John Reed, and had to be discarded or got away.
Because his mistress was politics and war.
Yeah, especially at that point in his career. So, in other words, what I had hoped would unite the treatment of Mrs. Luhan with these chapters on more political people is the way in which power and almost an obsession with power seems to run through all of these activities, whether they take the form of politics or primarily cultural criticism, or, as in her case, with this other very characteristic 20th century quest for personal salvation through intense relationships.
It's interesting. Intellectual is a social type, and yet power throughout the undercurring theme, and as it is today, of course. Today the word is used. Then the word perhaps wasn't used, suddenly maybe coming closer and closer to the core of the apple, you know.
The other thing about Mrs. Luhan is that her alienation, if you want to use that word, is so acute and oftentimes so powerfully expressed, and it, again, takes very characteristic forms, which you find in other intellectuals, many of whom are much more interested in politics than she is. We were talking about the identification of the intellectual with outsiders, and her career shows the sort of pathological possibilities of that kind of preoccupation. I think that the ability to look at life through other people's points of view, and to see how American society, for instance, looks to someone on the bottom, is probably the essential function of intellect, critical thinking. On the other hand, in Mrs. Luhan, this takes, as I say, a kind of pathological form, the glorification of the noble savage, the Indian, and consequently complete romanticization.
Her husband Luhan was an Indian.
He was, but this didn't prevent her somehow from seeing them in this completely false and romantic
Of course, this
way.
leads to a very funny anecdote that you have in the book, an incident on page 131, when she was praising the life of the noble savage.
Yes.
And one noble savage replied, "Let's change places." I think this is
That's
worth
very
quoting.
good.
Is this the
That
one here?
was a young man who published an open letter to Mrs. Luhan in a newspaper? Or,
Well, why don't you read it?
local
I think this is worth reading, Christopher Lasch.
A young Indian, yes, addressing her in a letter to the local paper, angrily proposed that they exchange places in view of her constant glorification of Indian life. She says at one point that the nice thing about the Indians is that they don't want progress. They don't want a dismal accretion of cars, sinks, stoves, and all. He says, "You can have all the horse and buggies you want, and I'll have your nice new cars. You drink muddy water from the mountains, and I and my wife and 5 children will drink nice clean water from your faucets." He says that what she doesn't understand is that we want to live like humans and not like animals. That's a very, very suggestive passage. I mean, the confrontation of the intellectual with the culture of poverty, and the difference between the way Oscar Lewis looks at the culture of poverty, with real sympathy and also with real horror, and Mrs. Luhan's glorification of it is very striking.
There was a quaintness here.
And spontaneous, untrammeled by civilized repressions.
Well, in a way, I suppose this led to D.H. Lawrence, didn't it?
Yeah, this is, again, Lawrence is this kind of central figure, I think, in 20th century thought, because he again represents both sides. He has a tendency to glorify the primitive, as he does in a number of places. But as his friends noted, he was horrified by actual contact with primitive life.
So he could, in short, he was brilliant in describing it.
Yeah.
But he batted zero in living it,
yeah.
encountering it.
Yeah.
This chapter called Politics as Social Control. And here we come to something, and just mark the note here. Not oppression, but weakness with overbearing manner breeds revolution.
Mm-hmm.
This particular theme, even now as we speak of the black power and the black liberation movement in America, indeed in all the world, is that it is not as though all the avenues are closed, therefore it's when a slight touch of the window is open.
Yes.
The perception is there.
That's right. Yeah. I don't think that dull, daily, grinding misery is ever a fruitful source of social protest, simply because it so completely inhibits consciousness of one's situation that it isn't even possible to view the fact that it's horrible. It's so horrible that your every effort is involved in survival.
Remember Roger Rao, the Indian writer, was describing some Indian villages where the poverty was just so overwhelming, and the despair as such. Not a chance of revolution.
That's right.
Not a ghost.
Yeah.
But where there's a slight open door, then the light comes in.
That's right. Yes. As far as the theme of politics as social control, this is again an instance of how certain intellectual currents of social and political thought before the First World War seem to point so clearly to what has emerged much more noticeably since the Second World War. This fascination with what you might call managerialism. And this is another way in which I think intellectuals have projected themselves as powerful people. And in a way, these people who are talking about social control and the possibilities for rational social advance, all of which would be naturally supervised and directed by intellectuals, since they were the people who understood the processes and had the expertise to cope with them and prescribe remedies. In a way, this was a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, because now intellectuals really are in a position to do precisely this with the results that we see.
So here now we talk about the managers, the arrangers, and we hear the phrase managerial society. And you even note that Christopher Lasch has here on this chapter, the prophetic note. But the manipulative note was rarely absent from their writings, these intellectuals then, the insistence that men could best be controlled and directed not by the old crude method of force, but by education, quote unquote, in its broadest sense.
Yes. I was thinking of some of the progressive educators. Dewey, in some of his moods, talks this way before the First World War. Even Bourne sometimes, who was then caught up in pragmatism and instrumentalism. Sociologists in particular, E.A. Ross, who probably now not many people remember, What was I going to say?
It's a matter of a new way of control, not oppression, but
Right.
having them adjust. And so
Well,
it comes to now, doesn't it?
Yes,
It comes
there's
to a sweet smile, does
yeah,
it not,
yeah,
of the
that's
manager?
and that indeed
Not
has
the whip,
become
but the sweet smile.
Yeah, right. The characteristic method of sort of liberal manipulation. There's some awfully revealing and kind of startling, horrifying quotations that reveal this. There's a passage in one of Dewey's essays, for instance, saying that something to the effect that what we've learned is that you can not only lead a horse to water, but you can induce him to drink. Or Newton D. Baker at one point telling how to deal with recalcitrant children in urban slums, and summing up what the social workers thought they had learned as the importance of holding out a stick of candy instead of beating people with a club.
Doesn't this come back to the article again? It always returns
Yes,
that, you know, the Congress Cultural Freedom, not really, and the CIA. Not a question. We're not talking now about other activities, military activities or paramilitary. We're talking about intellectual activities.
Yes.
The word, it's interesting how the word brainwashing is now used by two leading Americans.
It's
in
become
recent
more and
years.
more respectable.
Yeah.
I hope
Yeah.
that this will make
but
it
this is the first time
respectable.
it's been used in
Yes.
America. It's been
Yes.
used about others. Now it's used about us.
That's
Indeed,
right.
about two of our leading figures.
That's right. I guess it was during the Korean War that the word first appeared. At least that's my recollection. And of course, then it was something they were doing
Yeah.
to our boys.
But now there's something fascinating coming back to...
Well, there seems to be almost barely discernible a note of candor that seems to be forcing its way into public discussions.
And
in
so
the
something
last few
happens.
weeks.
I guess I love paradox. I love a parade, sang Harry Richmond. I love paradox. And we come to the theme of manipulation and how it's led to today. And you mentioned Edward Ellsworth Ross. It was also Edward
Yes,
Ross,
that's right. That's
University of
right.
Wisconsin, I
Yes.
think.
Uh-huh.
And so again, we come to planning and liberation, both planning at the same time. A country without, we found this out during the Depression, didn't we? That planning was necessary in order to overcome a crisis. At the same time, we're talking about individual and freedom, aren't we? This is even poor old John Bircher. This is what, in a simplistic way, this is what he's challenging, isn't he?
Yeah. There are points, not very many, at which a kind of radical critique of liberal manipulation does kind of meet in a tentative way a kind of alarm on the right. But I don't know. Some people have argued, in fact, that there's a real possibility of an alliance which would tap this kind of dissatisfaction and discontent and moral outrage.
Yeah,
I'm really
Goodman
not
has
very
mentioned a couple of
sanguine
times,
about the...
You mean the Young Americans for Freedom, say, and SDS?
Yeah,
has been
and
some
the
time.
fact that another point at which they might appear to jibe is in an opposition to centralized control and so on.
To what the flaccid middle, to
Yeah.
what might be the muscle-less flaccid, what can you,
Well, also, I'm at the mutual abhorrence of
Yes.
over-centralized bureaucratic control.
And so we come to another, we continue with Christopher Lasch, and you mentioned the New Republic and the role it played through the years. This is interesting, isn't it? New Republic and the war. The history is a fascinating one.
What seems to me to be true of the New Republic, especially if you compare it with, say, the nation, which has had a kind of parallel history over the years, I think is that the nation, in spite of some of its horrible periods, notably during the early years of the Second World War, has managed to live somewhat more comfortably with being, on the whole, on the outside and on the unpopular side of issues. Whereas the New Republic's history for a long period of time, probably less so maybe at the moment than at most times, but even now, the editors of the magazine, who've changed over the years, have turned first here and then there in the search for influence, power.
Again, we come to that, don't we? That word again. Always we can't put that down. Power. Again, because here was a magazine that, even though both had a similar history, one wanted to get inside the establishment, and the other to remain outside.
Yeah. During the First World War, for instance, that when I spoke of the cult of Wilson,
that's interesting. I thought of World War II, post World War II. You say the history then goes back.
Yes,
earlier.
really to its founding. And indeed, the great hope of the editors in 1914, when the New Republic was founded, was that this would be an organ very closely tied to Theodore Roosevelt. And then Roosevelt let them down, and they shifted their allegiance to Wilson.
Here again, the prophetic aspects of the figures in the book of Christopher Lasch. What makes it, I suppose, so amazing is that the past and present fuse. You see where the seeds of it. You spoke of the realists, the war liberals, World War I, and again, I put down here fathers of the Congress of Cultural Freedom.
Yes, and fathers also of a group of much better political thinkers in the 50s. Few of whom were associated with the Congress, and if they were, only in very formal capacity, like Hans Morgenthau and George Kennan, who, to their great credit, have emerged lately as critics of the Vietnamese War, but who in the 50s were taking very sort of hardline, realistic, so-called position. Less so Kennan, I guess.
Which leads to Lincoln Calkert and Colonel House. Colonel House, as you know, was the key advisor to Woodrow Wilson, the man, the intellect behind him, as FDR did, or Kennedy. He was, I suppose, the equivalent of Schlesinger to John Kennedy in a sense, wasn't he?
No, because Kennedy relied on Schlesinger much less than... House really was Wilson's right-hand man, and had very strong influence on Wilson, though not obviously an exclusive one. There were others. But of all the things I found in reading for this book, I think probably the most startling was the records of House's vision of himself and what he was doing, and these incredibly apocalyptic fantasies that he indulged himself in, the world collapsing, the old structure falling in ruins.
He was holding up the building. He was holding
Yeah.
up the wall of the building.
Yeah. And to find these in a man so close to power was staggering. This was some years ago, and I don't think that at that point one had the sense that one probably does now, though one should. And again, this is part of American innocence and naivete.
We come to the question of megalomania and power.
Exactly, and we have to, the fact that rulers may be absolutely mad, and that this is something that occurs not just in Russian opera, but
it isn't just, we got Borises all around, I think.
this is the kind of recognition that comes very slowly to an American. And it certainly surprised me when I read these things in probably 1961 or 62 in Lincoln Calkert's
But then we come
papers.
to his influence. Who was Lincoln Calkert?
He was a journalist, and himself an awfully interesting man, because he, too, had such a penchant for this kind of apocalyptic vision of things. One of the things, indeed, that I think characterizes 20th century politicized intellectuals is their penchant for thinking in sort of catastrophic terms. This was another attraction, incidentally, of Stalinism in the 30s, which, Whittaker Chambers, for instance, is an example of this kind of thinking in a lesser way, in a much more attractive way. I think Calkert is, too. He was raised in Maine, but became a journalist in Philadelphia during the First World War, and a close friend of House.
An enlightened man.
Yes, very, very, very. In fact, a very appealing man in most ways. Then in the 30s, he became extremely unhappy with the general drift of things, and specifically with Roosevelt and Roosevelt's foreign policies. And ended up
the way
as an
that
isolationist.
Raymond Moley or William Bullitt.
No, not so much Moley, or even Bullitt, because Calkert at least didn't become conservative. He did become an isolationist. His career in this respect reminds you of Charles Beard.
But what's interesting, I don't know why I put down Adley, Stevens. I don't know why, but I did. Something in my mind. I think I know. Being the friend of House, I mean, he did not believe something was happening, the invasion of Russia after the revolution. Did I misinterpret that?
I think that by that time, Colquitt had become sufficiently suspicious of House and Wilson.
I thought of Stevenson on the Eve of the Bay of Pigs, that's why.
Yeah, right. There's certainly, for a long time, Colquitt, who was alarmed, almost the minute we got into the war, the political climate changed noticeably, and the administration began cracking down on dissent and cracking down on peace talk, and repudiating the positions that it had taken itself a few months earlier on peace without victory and so on. Colquitt was alarmed by this, as a lot of people were, but he allowed his fears and apprehensions to be quieted for quite a long time by House.
How easy it is, then, to close your eyes, is the point, too. We come to that, don't we? Even for the most seemingly enlightened of men. And we come to our guest, of course, Christopher Lasch, and the book, which I should have interviewed him concerning this long ago, The New Radicalism in America, 1889 to 1963. And again, that subtitle, that's the key, Intellectual as a Social Type. And could I add the phrase, after 3 suspension points, seeking power? Lincoln Steffens. Well, perhaps we could end with Lincoln Steffens and intellectual and intellectual. Lincoln Steffens, we think of him as the muckraker, the remarkable journalist, the man who, reformer, became radical.
Yes, it was at the point when he realized that merely exposing corruption wasn't enough, and moreover, the point at which he realized that corruption in the old-fashioned sense wasn't the issue. It wasn't a question of people being bought, but his great recognition, which came around 1907, 1908, was that, as he put it, some people don't have to be bought. A remark that has occurred to me in connection again with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and that the thing about
you guys would have done it for nothing.
Yeah, exactly. And that was his point, and his growing awareness of the fact that the thing about the society he was analyzing was that it wasn't one in which bad men did bad things, but as he put it, that the social order required good people to do bad things. Then he began writing about America this way, and nobody was interested because he wasn't exposing any more corruption.
He was saying himself that he'd prefer a straight crooked politician to a reformer who seemingly is doing good and yet is bought without realizing he's being bought.
Yeah.
He even spoke of himself, certain things he didn't write, a self-censorship,
that's right,
the bribery that is innate.
Yes, that's right. He's a very difficult figure to live with because there's a great deal of the sort of poseur in Steffens, which manifests itself, among other places, in this cult of big bad men, as he called them. But on the other hand, there are genuine recognitions that lie behind these perceptions. Of all the people I dealt with, he was much the hardest to come to terms with.
A friend of mine, Pete Lyon, did the book on S.S. McClure, and he said Steffen was a rough one.
Yeah,
for
he
him.
is.
More than very rough. The poseur aspect was made it so tough.
Yes.
At the same time, not to hide the insights that he did have.
Yeah.
So how do we end? Perhaps end, the last chapter is the anti-intellectualism of intellectuals, and you speak of a number of them, and suddenly we think of a raffish figure. You mentioned him in Mailer. Intellectual as an entertainer, in a way, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. He, too, is an awfully difficult figure to understand, and I didn't even attempt to make anything like a rounded treatment of Mailer, partly because I can't, because he is difficult, and partly because his career is he's in mid-career. But I must say, I admire Mailer in many ways, even though I'm kind of horrified by some of the things he says and does, and by his own tendency to identify with people in power, like the Kennedys, whom he made a cult of, that I found kind of revolting. But his continual search for some attitude or style, or those are weak words.
And yet there's an actor here, isn't there? I mean, here is the theatrical
no question.
figure.
Yeah, but then who's to say that isn't
I'm
legitimate?
just wondering, Christopher Lasch, this Christopher Lasch, sound like a character in Mary Worth. I'm wondering now, what with mass media, with television,
Yes.
with radio, with electronic devices, whether the entertainer, the celebrity, let's put the intellectual as a celebrity.
Mm-hmm.
He's a intellectual dash celebrity, which may be a new development. I don't know.
Yes. I'm trying to think whether there have been.
Yeah. Have there been before? That's an interesting point. We know there have been athlete celebrities before.
Mm-hmm.
We know there have been gangster celebrities before. Not as much thanks to mass media, more.
Yeah.
And Bonnie and Clyde.
Yes.
Radio was coming into being, and so they enriched the lives of the poor with their journeys.
True.
But the intellectual celebrity, Mailer is a classic.
Yes,
example.
he's a beautiful example of that. And partly this also reflects, I think, the intellectual's wish to become an actor on the historical stage, which, again, is envisioned by Mailer as being a stage in a very literal sense.
Deer Park all over the lot. And so, at the end of the page, this comment that Christopher Lasch, I have argued, now ending the book near the end, he says, I have argued these fantasies of omnipotence of the intellectual, together with their concomitant fears of hostility and persecution, spring from the isolation of American intellectuals as a class from the main currents of American life. And you say further, you quote Ginsberg, how they must, and this is the attempt to identify with it, no matter how. And then you speak of William James comparing the tough-minded to the hard-bitten men of the mining frontier, the tender-minded, the tender-foot New Englanders over-refined and feet. And so we have the double thread here, don't we? The double thread.
Yes. That has also run through this conversation.
Well, the only moral as a postscript is there's a book, and it's a terribly exciting one, The New Radicalism in America by Christopher Lasch.
I wish it was a book that told you what to do.
Would you tell us what is?
I don't know.
Which may be the first big step. Recognition. After recognition, maybe the deed.
I don't know. You can talk about power and what seems to me the corrosive effect of this absorption with power. On the other hand, it also is a real political problem. The way I've attempted to resolve it before in my own mind is by taking the position I think I sort of started out with this conversation, that probably intellectuals can have more effect on people by being true to the values that they profess. And by no means does this imply an ivory tower. In the present case, it seems to me to require that intellectuals very actively oppose the war, which is a repudiation of their values, it seems to me, by any, no matter how you look at it. That what this country is doing in South Vietnam, North Vietnam, cannot be reconciled with what intellectuals are supposed to believe in. And that seems to me to be a form of power that intellectuals should concern themselves with.
So they need not play the role of the eunuch, need not play the role of the impotent.
No. But I'm also very uncomfortably aware that in recent months, this position has become more and more, I think, unsatisfactory to a lot of activists on the left now. And indeed, the generations these days almost go in months. A whole new generation seems to have grown up over the last summer, for whom I think the position that I'm trying to defend would seem a pretty pallid, futile position. Maybe they're right. On the other hand, I'm skeptical about the emergence from all of this of a movement, when in so many ways what was the left seems to be more at the moment preoccupied with killing itself off. Yeah.
So at the moment, not only is the atom been fragmented, but so many things.
Yes, so many things.
And you also pointed out this thing that Christopher is the new generation, something that was fresh a month ago is no longer. Janice Ian could be the Sophie Tucker next month.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So
the whole
obviously-
process of and this is a it's a reflection to what has now become very acute political crisis in this country. But I also have the feeling, and I argued at points in passing in this book, that this kind of acceleration of the generational process may have to do with sort of built-in features of 20th century life. The rapidity with which people seem to age in the 20th century is alarming. And again, you get this sense with Bourne, who is lamenting his lost youth at the age of 28 or something.
Today, at the age of 16, my lost youth. It was a Pfeiffer cartoon, that effect, not too long ago.
Yeah, right, exactly.
In any event, there's the book by Christopher Lasch, and perhaps we'll have an encore very soon, I trust.
I'd
New
like
developments
that.
and
Would be
new
nice.
works, new conversations. Alfred A. Knopf, the publishers, New Radicalism in America, by Christopher Lasch. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Stott.